G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and welcome to our webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. Canberra is Ngunnawal country, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us on this webinar today. I'm very glad to be back after a week's leave, and you might notice I've got a bit of a cough and a cold today, so I am at home. And just a quick reminder, I took myself off to get a drive-through COVID test here in Canberra on Monday afternoon at 4:30. And I got the results back by 2:12 from ACT Health. Thank you so much. They sent me back a text that I was negative, thank God. But just a reminder, if you've got any symptoms, please go and get tested, because now is definitely not the time to be complacent. During the pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly. We'll be finishing up in December, but the days and times do vary, so make sure that you're subscribed or find all of our webinars at tai.org.au/webinars so you don't miss out. And just a few tips before we begin to help make sure this runs smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists. And you should also be able to upvote questions of other people and make comments. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. Some people do find the chat a bit distracting, but we asked and most people wanted to keep it. So if that's you and you find it distracting, just click on it. It'll turn into a pop-up window and you should be able to minimize it out of the way. And lastly, a reminder, this discussion is being recorded and it will be posted on our website and emailed to you all afterwards after the discussion. So obviously the United States presidential election is much closer than the polls predicted. And while the current numbers are looking slightly better for Joe Biden than for Donald Trump, there are still many votes to be counted. And the Trump administration has indicated that it intends to dispute the results in several states and potentially try and stop the counting of remaining votes. If Donald Trump is re-elected president, then his decision to remove the United States from the Paris Agreement will stand. But if Joe Biden is elected president, his climate change policies could have implications for many other countries around the world, but particularly Australia. So if you've all, like me, been glued to the television and to Twitter for the results and are keen to know what's happening in the United States, as I am, we are delighted today to have two special guests to discuss exactly what's at stake with climate policy. And I'm delighted to introduce today Elan Strait, who served as the National Security Council's Director for Climate and Clean Energy at the White House. And before that, he was a negotiator on the Paris Agreement for the US Department of State, leading negotiations on the agreement's transparency and accountability provisions. And Kate Larsen. Kate specialises in the analysis of impacts of climate, energy policy and market trends in the United States. Kate worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where she was Deputy Director for Energy and Climate Change, and helped to develop President Obama's Climate Action Plan. From 2007 to 13, Kate worked at the US Department of State as the lead US negotiator on mitigation commitments in the United Nations climate negotiations. And Kate has worked at the International Energy Agency in Paris, the World Resources Institute in Washington, and the Environmental Defense Fund in California. They're both joining us in their personal capacity on this webinar today, and we're very grateful that they've made the time, and they'll be in conversation with our Climate and Energy Program Director, Richie Merzian. Welcome, Elan and Kate and Richie. Thank you so much for joining us. Kate, my first question is to you, just to kick us off, I guess. When do you think the presidential election will be called? And are you expecting a Biden win at this point?
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. We should have been prepared for this by now, but it's looking like it's down to a couple of states, a couple of key swing states. Biden is just short of the 270 electoral votes required. He can make up that difference by winning just Nevada and Arizona, which are anticipated to make a call based on delivery of all the remaining absentee ballots and mail-in ballots by, within the next 2 hours, potentially for Arizona, and probably by tomorrow morning, US time for Nevada. If those 2 states both go to Biden, then he will have the 270 electoral college votes that he needs. There will be further challenges, but the other remaining states are still pretty close as well. So that's Pennsylvania, Georgia, what's left? North Carolina. Those states are, we've stopped trusting the polls at this point, so it's really hard to tell, but a lot of the remaining votes are coming from absentee ballots and mail-in ballots, and those have tended to be Biden voters. And so I think that's why we have a lag in seeing the true election results, but those states may come in even a day or two later. So we're going to be glued to our screens tonight and tomorrow morning, and hopefully I think that will give us some clarity, although it's very likely there will be continued challenges from the Trump administration on recounting some of those very close races. States like Wisconsin and Michigan and others have rules that allow a runner-up candidate to request a recount, and it's very likely a Trump administration would do that.
Richie, do you want to pick it up from there?
More just a question of what does that look like then, Kate or Elan, in terms of what potentially a month or more of uncertainty in terms of the result. So what could we expect, and what does that mean in terms of in terms of leadership? Where does that go? Will it remain with Trump until January 20th, or will we start to see a transition?
President Trump will remain president until January 20th or around there, when there would be no change of leadership. I imagine if the election challenges continue, that would be a very primary focus of our president for the coming months, at a time when we are really needing focus on stimulus and recovery measures and public health measures. If more than just Nevada and Arizona go for Biden, I think there would probably be a general feeling among most Americans, press, media, and others that the results will hold. The recount that Trump campaign could request really doesn't typically turn up a large difference in the outcome. In the states that are the closest right now, like Wisconsin, Biden is up by over 20,000 votes. These recounts tend to turn up maybe a couple of hundred extra one way or another, but they don't fundamentally change the results.
Mm. Elan, did you want to add anything? Otherwise,
just to add a little bit on the timeline here. So as Kate said, what will definitely happen is President Trump will remain president until January 20th. The reason that's important is that we have a very strong sense in the United States of one president at a time. And so in the scenario in which Biden, it looks like Biden will eventually get the 270 electoral votes needed to become president-elect. In that situation, President-elect Biden is not going to be making new policy announcements, new policy pronouncements, and instead allow President Trump to obviously serve the rest of his term as president. And that will have implications, of course, for things like December 12th, which is a UK-UN hosted event on the Paris anniversary. And so there will be milestones between, as Kate was talking about, whether it's about public health or whether it's about climate, between now and January 20th, that President-elect Biden will not participate in as the head of state, of course.
Mm-hmm. On that anniversary, today, at least in the United States, where it's still the 4th of November, the Wednesday, it's the official withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement. I know that both of you worked over many years, poring over the text for your particular work streams, each comma and each full stop and each choice of word to make sure that the Paris Agreement landed and was amenable to the US as well as the other 195 signatories at the start. I mean, how does it feel to know that today the US has withdrawn, and how quickly could it rejoin?
Well, I'll answer that because Kate, I think to her credit, abandoned me before we got to Paris on the negotiating team. So what I'll say is, it stings to obviously have the withdrawal be effective today. One thing that obviously softens it is what looks like the fact that if the election results continue to hold, that we'll be back in as soon as possible, that the full withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement will take place over 3 months. That's a categorically different thing than what happened when the US did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol and never joined. We're actually in a situation in which the US was only out, led the negotiations on the agreement, put forward a target, was in for 4 years, out for 3 months, and we'll be back in. And so I don't think what we're seeing here is a repeat of this US in and out drama. I think really, if you look at the politics and where the US is, the US had never really left. And I think that's true both in sort of literally the federal government was in for the last 4 years, and also figuratively as a matter of public opinion. I don't think American opinion ever reduced from the high support that the Paris Agreement and climate action had throughout the country. Also, I would say that when we were negotiating the agreement, we very much knew that the possibility that an incoming administration would not view it the way that we did. And in terms of what that means for the negotiations, we wanted to develop, and I think we did develop, something that would have bipartisan support in the United States. So in other words, that's the whole structure of the Paris Agreement, was in some ways responding to political needs in the United States. So the first is that it's universal, meaning that in particular, China was going to have the same obligations under the agreement that the United States did, which was a key ask of in particular the Republican Party, and also that the targets themselves would be nationally determined. So you had no international agency or the UN telling the United States what it had to do. So I wasn't terribly surprised that there was going to be opposition to the agreement in the Republican Party. We sort of anticipated that and tried to work around it. I was surprised, of course, that President Trump ended up going through with the withdrawal, because given what I just said, it didn't really make sense, and it never really made sense except as an act of sort of like retribution against the previous president.
I'd also add, if the US was ever to go through 4 years of disengagement from the international climate negotiations, these were the right 4 years. The climate agreement under the Paris Agreement was baked before Trump came in. The US participated under a Trump administration in continuing to develop the rule book, the more detailed requirements under the Paris Agreement. But really, it was not a period where major political decisions under the Paris Agreement were made, and that was ended up being very fortuitous. The Paris Agreement is still whole. It's still something the US can immediately rejoin and follow the Paris rules. That was a big concern, was that a disengaged US would come back to find an agreement that we couldn't participate in, and that's not happened.
I think
I'm on mute. Sorry, I took a week off and now I've forgotten how Zoom works. That's how it goes. Kate, I was going to ask you, correct me if I'm wrong, but Biden is promising 100% clean energy by 2035 if he's elected. Is that possible? And can you give us an idea here in Australia of what the energy sector in the United States looks like right now?
Sure. So that's a pretty ambitious timetable for moving to 100% clean electricity, and I would read that to mean not just 100% renewables, but zero emission electricity. So that could include other sources of electricity like nuclear. It could include carbon capture from fossil powered plants. So there's more flexibility in a standard like that. It is very ambitious. The one, there's two types of ways that you could assess the credibility of meeting a goal like that. One is, whether it's possible given our current energy mix to do that, and whether we have the ability to transition that quickly. I think we are experiencing a pretty steep decline of coal generation in the US that started before the Trump administration, was accelerated during the Trump administration, largely because of two factors. That's continued state level policies that promoted zero emission electricity, but also because the cost of renewables, but also really cheap natural gas were eating into coal's market share. I think in 2005, the electricity mix in the US was about 30% coal. Today we're down to about 20%. And our modeling shows that that decline, even under a Trump administration, if no new US policies are implemented today, we're on track to get to about 10% from coal over the next 5 years. And that continues to decline through 2030. It doesn't zero out, but it's, the coal's days are numbered in the US. So that is something that back in the day when the Obama administration was writing its Clean Power Plan, the rules that Trump overturned that would have begun this transition, we've exceeded those goals already, even though that policy was overturned. So that is a very encouraging development, one we expect to continue. The problem is, if the US wants to be on track for net zero by 2050, which is another goal that Biden has set forward in his platform, we really need to begin to deal with natural gas fired generation, which has been a bridge for the US to get away from coal, but over time it's a fossil fuel. It continues to release emissions, and over time, cheap natural gas and renewables tend to start pushing out other non-emitting sources of power in the US, like nuclear. We have an old nuclear fleet that is not very economic, and so some of those same forces that push out coal could start pushing out nuclear, and that's not good when it comes to zero carbon electricity. Nuclear is a pretty big share, 10 to 15% right now. So that answers largely the transition question. We can do it. There are lots of pathways for doing it. The political will and political opportunities now, as we'll probably talk a little bit about the Senate, doing that at a federal level will be a challenge. Getting from 30 to 40% to 100% in a matter of 15 years is a big challenge. The tools that a Biden administration, if he is elected, are somewhat limited, because our regulatory authority comes from the 1970s and 1990s, and we have jerry-rigged it to help us deal with climate change. There are a lot of other challenges. There are ways that a Biden administration could do that using its executive authority without Congress, but getting to 100% is going to be a big challenge that would likely require congressional activity. And with the Senate looking like it will stay Republican, unclear how that would happen, though we're not ruling it out. There are a lot of other ways through spending, stimulus, and other ways that you could definitely push closer to that goal, but it will be challenging to get there without congressional support.
Yeah, I just want to, that's such a good analysis, Kate. I just want to add a couple of things. Well, before I add a couple of things, I just want to emphasize what Kate had said was, is it possible? And the answer is yes, it's possible. Of course it's technically possible. The question is obviously the politics of it. And just two things I want to add. The first is that renewable energy in the United States is, climate is a political issue that seems to track blue and red states. Like, do you acknowledge climate change? Do you want to act on climate change, et cetera? What's not a blue or red state issue is renewable energy. So the two of the largest states for renewable energy in the United States are Iowa and Texas, which are both reliably Republican states. And really this has been seen as an economics question for a lot of states who have opened their electricity markets and found that renewable energy is often a very good source of electricity at an affordable price. And in particular, and I don't know how true this is in Australia, but I would imagine it's true also, is a terrific source of revenue for farmers who might be struggling to have sustainable yields, because you could site especially wind power on your farm. And so there is a huge economic boon, not only to the states that adopt renewable energy policies, but also to the individuals and in particular farmers in those states. And the second thing I want to add is just to add on to what Kate was saying about the regulatory authority. I think the Obama administration really did sort of like really get up to the boundaries of what what the legislation would allow them to do with regulation. And of course it was challenged in court, and that was a different court. So we have an even more conservative court in the United States, and it's likely to be even more challenging to get any of those regulations upheld by that court.
One thing I'd also add is a way that a Biden administration, a way to gauge the level of ambition often in federal policy is to look at what the leadership states have done. So everyone is familiar with California. California often leads the charge in terms of state climate policies. California's goal is to reach 100% zero emission electricity by 2045. That's their current goal. So the reaching that at the federal level is a big move. And so I think there will be a period of considering how do state leadership states and the federal government work together to align their goals, to push harder in states that have already started that trajectory. But again, just to put that 2035 goal in perspective, the most ambitious state in the nation currently has that goal to occur 10 years later. So it represents a huge step forward for the US.
Elan, before we get kind of back to the politics, and you've both alluded to what's going to happen in the Senate, which I would like to come back to. But can you explain to us what's happening at the sub-national level, and can you explain the We Are Still In movement for us?
Yeah, sure. So the We Are Still In movement was launched in June 2017. So it was launched in the days after President Trump announced that he intended to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. And the purpose of the coalition in the first instance was to really reassure the rest of the world that climate action is going to continue in the United States, regardless of the federal government's position on climate or the presence in the Paris Agreement. And the reason why that was so important is because those targets under Paris, as I said before, the efforts that countries have put forward are voluntary. Our concern was that if the US took a step back, that every other country was also going to take the opportunity to step back. And we wanted people to know that the US isn't stepping back. Americans are still in, even if the federal government is withdrawing from Paris. So we launched the statement in June of 2017 that had over 1,000 signatories from businesses, cities, states, universities, and so on. And when we launched it, we were like, great, show of force, rest of the world, they know we're still in. And then we had a press call where we announced the thing, and the press said, great, now what are you all gonna do with that? And I was like, that's a great question. And we hadn't really thought about it. And so what we then got to work doing was we sort of realized that this coalition could be an extremely powerful force. And as we looked at the numbers, we realized right away, there were members of this coalition in all 50 states. And in fact, it kept growing and growing and growing in the weeks after. And so, for example, 2 weeks after, Walmart joined. And Walmart is not only a huge corporation, the largest private sector employer in the United States, it has an enormous supply chain. The emissions of Walmart's supply chain are the same as France's emissions. It is an enormous supply chain. And so we realized that this coalition was going to have could have massive impact on emissions, and not just sort of domestic emissions, but global emissions. And now where we're at is that there are 4,000 signatories to We Are Still In. So those are signatories from business, city, state, university, and now healthcare, faith, cultural institutions, and tribes who are all coming together to work together, not just individually, but together on solving the climate crisis. And one of the things that's so exciting about We Are Still In is not just that over the last 4 years, they've been able to communicate with the rest of the world about climate and undertake action here at home, but that they could be, and they are, a massive domestic political force. So one of the issues that we've always had in the United States, obviously, as is also the case in Australia, is you have this very powerful entrenched fossil fuel interests that politically has a lot of influence. And the truth is, in the United States, we've never had a counterweight. We've never had a political influence that is as powerful as the fossil fuel interest is in Washington. And with We Are Still In, with 4,000 signatories from across the country, from all these different sectors, it is the case that for the first time, heading into hopefully a new administration, that we have a political force that can begin to advocate for climate action, for something new. And I think that's incredibly exciting, and something I wish we had all along, but just it took Donald Trump withdrawing from Paris for it to finally happen.
Moving back to the international space, assuming, knock on wood, that Biden wins and the US rejoins the Paris Agreement, beginning that process on the 20th of January, and then it's in by February. Biden's promised to convene a summit to push for more ambition. Will we see a more ambitious nationally determined contribution from the US resubmitted to the Paris Agreement? Currently, it's 26 to 28% emission reductions by 2025, which is similar to Australia's target, except Australia's is weaker. It's to 2030. Could we be seeing something more ambitious? And then the second part is that Biden said he's also going to try and regain the mantle of US climate leadership. And that includes coming after what has been dubbed, climate cheats. So those who are really underperforming on the climate front. Now that obviously has relevance to Australia, which is doing that. Australia's plan to meet its Paris Agreement target is to use leftover assigned units from the Kyoto Protocol, which far outweigh the abatement required to meet our weak target by 2030. How do you see Biden's leadership play out on the climate front? Could we see this climate summit? And what would this mean for countries that are underperforming?
I'll take that first. Or you want to go, Elan?
Did you want to do the target one, respond about the target, or did you want to?
Either one.
Go ahead.
Okay. So
diplomatic.
Yeah, right. I think so there are so many things that a Biden administration could do straight out the gate to reestablish American relationships. I think the relationship building part, reinstituting our diplomatic corps, making climate a clear priority in every bilateral conversation that we have at the head of state level, that is a for sure thing. I think it's very likely also that the plans to hold a summit are likely. I think where and there's so many other ways that a re-engaged US on the international scene will make a big difference. But you picked out two of the most critical, uncertain pieces. And I think one of the best things that the US can do to rebuild credibility internationally is to take action domestically and have a strong domestic agenda. And so the current election status, in particular, looking at the Senate, and the fact that there wasn't a huge landslide, I think that will really make it makes it more complicated, more of an uphill battle for the U.S. to implement Biden's plans and goals. And the question for the U.S. is, how best can we build credibility internationally? Is it to be ambitious about those goals and set those forward as part of the Paris Agreement commitment? Something like a 40 to 50% emission reduction by 2030 is what is in line with net zero by 2050. I think what a Biden administration will have to contend with is, given our political situation, how credible is that to the international community? Does that help or hinder our efforts to build that? So my guess would be that it may be a little long, while the US might rejoin Paris on day one and initiate those diplomatic relationships and efforts, it may want to be more cautious about developing its own plans about what kind of new target it would take on, how it would communicate that internationally. It also means the US needs to approach climate leadership with a little bit more humility than we have in the past. I know that's not a great American trait, but walking in as the returning champions after these 4 years is not something that we can or should do. And so I think like the US leadership means that we come apologize to our friends, work closely with our allies, in particular Europe and others, to really rebuild that together, rather than go it alone in the way that Americans have tended to do.
Elan, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I did. Kate and I actually in particular have I would say an ongoing argument about that very question about the target, whether it's better to put forward something that is credible and therefore primarily establishes the US is taking this agreement very seriously. We're not going to say we're going to do something we can't do, or if it's better to put forward a reach target that reflects more of what the US's responsibility is globally to the climate challenge. I think it's a really interesting debate, and I think this is what the U.S. is going to have to wrestle with. I fall on the other side, which is that it's better for the U.S. to put something out that's a real kind of stretch, that's not necessarily a. I mean, we should give what we should take what the agreement is giving us, which is that these targets aren't legally binding. You're not saying I'll be punished if I don't hit this. You're saying this is what I intend to do. And I think it's super important for the U.S. to put out a North Star for itself about where it wants to get to, and something that actually motivates the world to reach a little bit further too. Because one thing we know to be true is that what would help all of these countries go further and faster is individual increases in ambition fuel other increases in ambition. The more that the US is doing at home, it makes it easier for Japan to do, makes it easier for Australia to do, for China to do, because you're deploying technology and reducing costs. And so I do think that having the world have this sort of increased cycle of ambition, helpfully mobilized in part by the US returning in a humble way, but saying that we recognize our responsibility here and we're really going to reach, I think would be a really good thing. Having said that, I agree with Kate that it should be a very deliberate process. And one thing I really want to emphasize about the process is because of the nature of the last US target, so it was negotiated as part of a bilateral deal with China to announce our target in 2014, there wasn't a public inclusive policy process in setting that target. And that was necessary because it was part of the negotiations. But I think this time it would really benefit the United States to have a process where you were getting more public input, more local government input, more private sector input into a level of ambition. And I think that could actually help rally more action than it otherwise would.
Sorry, one last thing. Richie, you mentioned punitive measures for countries who are not meeting their goals. I think this kind of question comes into play as countries like Europe and others start to contemplate putting border measures on countries who are not acting enough. This is something that the Biden campaign has said that we would do too. What happens in a scenario where the US tries to do more and doesn't get there? I think part of setting an international NDC that's ambitious and a stretch goal, the question becomes, will other countries punish the US for not meeting that goal? Would we then be on the receiving end of border measures because the US has failed to be on track with its goal? So we're entering a new era, I think, where before it was negotiating international agreements, that's been done now. And the question is, what other levers do governments have to compel other countries to take action? We are testing now whether if I do what I say I'll do, you do what you say, but we've seen that governments have gone backwards. And so what other measures are required? And I think this is an era where finding ways to penalize countries or industries for not acting, that becomes a more important tool that we have to explore. And I think the US will be in an interesting spot that we would like to apply those measures, but what are the metrics we're applying to ourselves?
We might go to questions from the audience now, if that's all right. So the first one here is from Simon Bradshaw, and I might flick this one to you first, Kate, and then to you, Elan. It's coming back to that question about the Senate again. How concerned are you about the Senate race at the moment, and how would a Republican Senate affect a potential Joe Biden climate agenda?
Yeah, this one is hard because one of the most important tools that a Biden campaign planned to deploy were $2 trillion in spending toward clean energy priorities. That was only going to be possible with congressional approval. And I think the thinking was that at a time when we will need to pass broad stimulus measures and recovery measures, infrastructure in the US is really at an abysmal state. All of these investments need to happen. And with a willing and engaged Senate would we be able to appropriate that kind of funding. I think that would have accelerated all of these market trends that I've been talking about. It would have made the regulators' job much easier. And now without those investments, in particular, much of that money would have gone to states, and states are now facing really critical budget shortfalls. Those are the states that would have been investing in EV charging infrastructure. A lot of those measures happen at the local level. And so I think that's really going to be, even before we start talking about passing new climate legislation, which is already an uphill battle, that $2 trillion was really a critical component of jumpstarting sort of the clean energy economy in the US. And it will just make that so much harder without a Senate. I will say, because I'm trying to find lots of silver linings, 2022 is a year where many more Senate Republicans are facing re-election. So this is not the end. There may be more opportunities 2 years from now. So I think that a lot of the Senate dynamics we're seeing now will really be with an eye to some of those more moderate Republicans getting reelected in 2022. We'll have to see what the Senate leadership does, whether they are as obstructive as they have been in the past, what that means for reelection chances and a Democratic majority in 2022.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to try the silver lining part because I think it's a good idea to do it on this front, because I agree that if passes prologue, what you're going to see is a Republican Senate that's going to do everything they can to obstruct the agenda of the administration if it's of the other party. So the silver lining is the following two things. One is that I do think that no matter what happens in the election, Congress is going to appropriate trillions of dollars of recovery assistance, hopefully as soon as possible next year. So I do think that there will be a Recovery Act of some kind, and I do think that that'll primarily be focused on infrastructure. And then I think the question is, are you investing in traditional infrastructure? Or are you investing in new, modern, clean infrastructure? And I think that is a debate that I'm confident on the merits the Democrats would win. And then it's just a matter of votes in the Senate. But I do think that there is going to be a big opportunity next year to talk about infrastructure spending in a way that we haven't done over the last 4 years. And I think if Biden wins and is president, we have an advantage in that debate. The second thing is that the Obama administration also experimented with different programs and policies that could sort of work with the Senate that they had, effectively using their appropriations or their funding to achieve ends that they weren't able to do through new laws, basically. And I think the most successful, or at least one of the most impactful versions of that, was the Race to the Top program in education, which gave awards or prizes, extremely large awards or prizes, to states that were able to enact education reforms. And I could imagine a similar type of program that's a race to the top for states and cities on the climate front, in which they are awarding grants or other prizes to states that go sort of above and beyond whatever the federal policy is. So I do think that obviously a Republican Senate's going to make it a lot harder. I think if they choose to go all obstruction, then we have our work cut out for us for sure. But I also think that there are plenty of programs and things that this country can do to drive innovation in the clean technology space that would make a big difference.
The next question is from Janine Kitsonen and also from Paul Charles Leopardi. And they're asking about, we've done quite a few webinars recently around electric vehicle policy. So their question is, will conversion of the transport fleet and the car industry to electric in America be culturally difficult given the cult of NASCAR? I'm not sure how big that cult is. And the other one is, what is likely to happen with the transition to electric transportation, and can the USA catch up to China and Norway, for example?
Well, we're getting an electric Hummer, so you know about that. And Ford is producing the most popular pickup truck in the U.S. is the Ford F-150. So culturally, I think we'll be just fine. But one huge thing about a potential Biden win is that long ago, California was given the authority to regulate vehicle emissions because of its unique problems with smog. That is something that has been under threat under a Trump administration. California needs permission from the federal government to go above and beyond the federal rules. California just announced its goal to have 100% electric vehicle sales by 2035, and trucks as well by 2045. Huge, big leap. And that is something that at least 13 to 15 other states copy California's rules. More states may copy them. That's something that under a Biden administration, California will be able to move forward with that, that it would no longer be under threat. So that is a huge deal. A Biden administration could also use its authority to regulate emissions from vehicles, rules that Trump significantly rolled back, could use those to push them even further. Biden has committed to 100% electric vehicles, but not committed to a timeline. And so that's an area where, we, with some combination of state action, a lot of auto companies are now really on the cusp of producing a lot of electric vehicles. That will be a huge push. I think getting to, the next 5 years is going to be tight because we don't set policy for those goals until the next 5 to 10 years. So that's really going to be a key focus of the Biden administration is dealing with vehicles and with fuels. So that's another area where there are upcoming decisions about our federal fuel policies that would allow electricity to qualify as a renewable fuel and get credits. And that's an area where we can incentivize electric vehicles through those subsidies for electric fuels.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Elan?
Yeah, just real quick. I think the clean transportation work is ripe for a lot of international cooperation. I think, as Kate was saying, watching states and the private sector cooperate in the United States is quite exciting. But I also think that those states and private sector companies cooperating with states and companies in other countries is something that I would love to see a new administration ramp up over the next 4 years. It's truly a global problem, and I think that the way to put it best for the United States is that if we don't really invest heavily in clean car manufacturing in the U.S. as soon as possible, we're going to completely lose the market share of car purchasing around the world, because the rest of the world's going to move to electric cars. They don't have the same cultural associations we do with the Ford F-150. And I think if we don't invest heavily in that, then we're going to lose out to, in particular, China and India on clean car manufacturing. And I think that's a competitive disadvantage for the United States.
It's interesting. We've had this debate around electric vehicles in Australia over our pickup trucks. But
end of the weekend.
Yeah, we call them utes here. And yeah, that's right. Our Prime Minister basically said that electric vehicles will kill our weekends because we can't go camping and tow trailers and caravans and basically destroy our way of life. Which is ridiculous because Australia also just shut down its car manufacturing industry. So we're a car taker, not a car maker. So we will have to import EVs. And Toyota makes, one of the most popular pickup trucks here, and they are turning it into an EV as well. So hopefully our 0.6% of EV cars will grow rapidly too. But not holding our breath on that one either.
You know what really destroys your way of life is massive, unabated, out of control wildfires.
Tell us about it. Yeah. Last summer was particularly horrific. And It's been quite a year, starting with bushfires and ending with the pandemic. But
yeah,
sorry, Richie, keep going.
yeah, no, and likewise, Kate, you're in California as well, so our sympathies to you guys too, off the back of your summer. But sort of taking it back up to that international level, you mentioned, Elan, that that basically part of the engagement in the Paris Agreement was to try and make it bipartisan in terms of how you engaged. And that included ensuring that it was universal, that all countries, all parties to the Paris Agreement took on commitments. They determined it through their NDCs, but ultimately they took on commitments, and that included China. That sort of universality often gets lost amongst conservatives here. They claim that China's not doing anything really under the Paris Agreement, and therefore Australia and other developed countries are doing heavy lifting and taking on a hit. However, one of the major wins behind the Paris Agreement was that sort of bilateral work between the US and China to really stitch up an approach that then became the foundation for others to join on. And also because it represents a critical mass of emissions. Along with the EU, you're looking at over 50% of global emissions. Like, what opportunities exist under a Biden administration for building that bridge again with China? And will it just be all carrots, or will it also include potentially sticks as well, including in terms of onshoring a lot of that clean energy development that the US is capable of manufacturing itself if it wanted to, rather than, say, importing panels from China? So what are we looking at in terms of that relationship going forward in the climate context?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, I think the biggest challenge of the climate foreign policy for a new administration is going to be the China relationship. I think on the one hand, that process is that relationship with China is going to be emboldened by China's new announcement of net zero by 2060, and by increasing their NDC, whatever they increase it to. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that China's not doing as much as they can on climate. And in fact, their investments in coal and their investments both domestically and through the Belt and Road Initiative on their own, even if every country was on pace for a target that was consistent with, keeping warming below 2 degrees on their own, they could have the world blowing past our climate goals. And so I think those are serious things. And Richie, I think you said it perfectly. It's a combination of sticks and carrots that are going to be needed. I do think that one of the best places for cooperation between a new administration and China is going to be on climate and clean energy. And I think that's a good thing. I think we need a different kind of relationship with China geopolitically than we've had over the last 4 years. So having an opportunity to collaborate on something, I think, is going to be great. On the other hand, I think it's going to take real work for the United States to really rally a number of countries in and work with Europe in particular, who's been doing this for the last 4 years, on creating sort of a coalition of countries that are oriented in a different direction than China's investments in coal. And that can be through the G7, or it can be through other forms. But instead of just having a focus on what is China's target, is China on pace for its target, like really integrating the climate issue into our international trade policy. And I think there's many ways to do that, but I think thinking critically about how we can use our trade levers in the United States and with partners in Europe and the rest of the world to influence China's investments, I think is a really good way to think about it, and it would include, therefore, some sticks.
I want to add, we have, I work at the Rhodium Group, a research firm that also has an office in Hong Kong, and a bunch of China experts that really follow the US-China political relationship. And we are in way different territory than we were under an Obama administration in terms of our approach to China. Trump is an anomaly in itself, but a Biden administration will be much tougher on China. There are so many issues to resolve, and I think this administration is not likely to take the same approach, even when it comes to climate, as a Obama administration did. There will be a lot of effort, I think, to look for partners in Asia to balance and counter China, and I think that's it's really going to be interesting to see how the climate piece fits in, because it is one area where there is potential for collaboration. But when it comes to technology and human rights and and other aspects of the very difficult U.S.-China relationship. I think we are in a whole new world, and I anticipate much fewer carrots when it comes to engagement with the U.S. and China.
The next question I've got is from Richard Tuffin, and he asks, what action will Biden take in regard to fracking, if any, in the United States? And I'll just put that in the context of here in Australia, our government, our federal government, has really been pushing a gas-fired economic recovery and really leaning hard into gas. And I know, obviously, gas has been, you referenced it earlier, Kate. But yeah, what's Biden's policy in regard to fracking? I might come to you first, Kate.
This has been one of those surreal issues where, because Pennsylvania is a key swing state, it's really been a point that has been brought up by the Trump administration, asserting that Biden would ban fracking, and Biden claims that he would not do that. I think the original position of the Biden campaign was really to focus on public lands. So a good portion of fossil development happens on public lands, and that is something that would be very straightforward for a Biden administration to not only halt fracking, but to put reduce the subsidies and really limit fossil development on public lands. But there's a huge share on private lands, and I think that's what most concerns the oil industry, and that is something that has been coming up. I would just say, I think in the political landscape post-election now, with the Senate makeup the way that it looks, and public opinion not skewing as far in terms of a blue wave as we originally anticipated, this may be an area that the Biden administration is a little bit more conservative because of their considerations for 2022 and 2024. I am just speculating here, but this seems like an area where in a more centrist type approach, if that wins out, that fracking itself, today the Biden campaign has not said that they would limit fracking, but I think it's certain the administration would target methane leaks and other areas where fossil development contributes to emissions. But this is going to be an interesting question for going forward, is how closely the Biden administration really looks at fossil development as a whole, and giving priorities to natural gas in particular.
Is there anything you would like to add to that, Elan?
I'm so glad Kate answered that question. I think the only thing I would add is Kate's probably right on the speculation of the politics of it, but the real issues with fracking, or at least the issues with fracking, and I think really sit with voters, is the effect that it has on water quality, and I think that's not necessarily a climate issue, and it's also not necessarily a federal issue. And so I think if there are the Americans that are passionate about these issues, and there are many, and I want to talk about that in a second, would be better served to focus a lot of that energy on state and local policy and local enforcement of environmental regulations than they would on a climate bill through Congress. And I think you could achieve your end goal better.
And the last question I've got here, we might have time for just one more, was around action to reduce emissions from agriculture. So the United States obviously has a huge agriculture industry, but so does Australia. So that's one that we watch with keen interest as well. Do you want to, I'll come to you again first, Kate, keep the order.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, agriculture is an area where there is a lot of space for bipartisan agreement. And one of the areas that has been making progress is thinking about soil carbon. So ways that you can, largely through incentives, I think regulation of the agricultural sector here is a third rail and will continue to be for a while. But we've been waiting for a carbon market to miraculously emerge for the last 20 years, and farmers have been ready to get these offsets that they've been promised for a long time. I don't think that's the framework that we will have. Carbon pricing is pretty unlikely to happen in the US, but this is an area where in a context of recovery from the pandemic, that incentives for farmers to adopt practices that conserve carbon in soils. This is an area where there's likely to be some movement. It's a bipartisan conversation. And so I think this is a possible path for additional work, and in a way that hasn't happened yet in the U.S. So this is new territory, and a place that in relation to public lands and land conservation would be a whole package of things that could move forward even under the likely future Senate that we're looking at.
We don't have a huge amount of time left, only 5 minutes, but I wonder if I could come to you both for kind of some final observations or last thoughts. Obviously, it's been a huge slog even just to get to the presidential election, and now the results are kind of more up in the air than anyone was expecting. But thinking about what we know about the results now and how likely a Biden administration is, what would be your final thoughts on where climate policy is going? I'll start with you, Kate.
I'll let Elan go first because
A couple of thoughts. The first is that one thing we do know for sure is whoever wins the Electoral College, the truth is that Joe Biden received more votes for president than any other candidate in the United States has ever received. And he won a majority of votes. And those votes are still being counted, and he's going to run up that score even more. And when you ask voters, hey, why did you vote for Joe Biden in record numbers, the answer consistently is climate change. And I think one of the legacies of this election is going to be that climate was a winning issue for the Democrats. And I think people are going to be shocked when the results are finally finished at how many young people came out to vote in this election. There were just amazing figures yesterday of universities that had 100% turnout for all their registered students. And Madison, Wisconsin, which is the home of University of Wisconsin, had record turnout for the city. And I think you're going to see the politics of climate change, which have already changed a lot over the last 4 years, move very rapidly in the direction of demanding urgent action from the federal government. And I think, I had a boss at the White House who said, nobody's ever going to do anything on climate until somebody loses an election as a result of climate. And the truth is, in many ways, this election was razor thin. Young people turned out. Donald Trump lost because of climate change. And so I think that's going to be a total step change in politics in the United States. And we may not see it immediately, but this is going to be a very different decade for climate than last decade was.
And you, Kate?
Yeah, I'd agree. It came up in the debates all the time. It became an issue of central importance to the election for the very first time in the US. I think it also means when we're looking for silver linings that in the way that it happened in 2009, when a lot of states had been taking climate action under a Bush administration and then Obama came in, I think a lot of the subnational actors took their foot off the pedal waiting for the federal government to take control. And I think what we have learned over the last 4 years is that every single actor of our economy needs to put the pedal to the metal. And that is not going to let up. I think given the closeness of this election, that has become clear. I think that states, cities, corporates are going to continue to be engaged. And I think actually we are looking forward to 4 years of really interesting innovation in US climate policy rather than picking up where the Obama administration left off. We're going to need to get creative. And I think a couple of things that are that make me optimistic are financial regulators are increasingly looking at climate risk. The Securities and Exchange Commission, when it comes to reporting, a lot of other actors in the U.S., the Fed and central bank in the U.S. Is very likely to get more involved, and I think that is encouraging as well. That those signals will affect the economy in a way that regulations maybe can't. So it's going to be a new era for U.S. climate policy, and we're excited to jump right in.
Well, we might wrap it up there. Thank you so much for your time today, both of you. Normally this is where we'd ask for a round of applause, but thank you so much for joining us, Elan and Kate and Richie today. And thank you everyone who has joined us on this today for your great questions. And please join us over the next few weeks for some more exciting webinars. Next Monday, we're sticking with the topic of climate change. On Monday, the 9th of November, we'll be talking with Independent MP Zali Steggall at 1 o'clock on why Australia needs the Climate Act. And on Wednesday, the 11th of November, we'll be talking about how childcare reforms can help power Australia's economic recovery. And that'll be with former South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill and former Chief Minister of the ACT, Kate Carnell. And please make sure that you're subscribed to our Follow the Money podcast. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And please remember, stay 1.5 meters away, wear a mask if you can, keep washing those hands, and stay safe out there, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Kate.